Mashiach is a reality. To me, it means ultimate goodness, the purpose of creation.
Mashiach is a time of peace, and it's also a time of inner harmony with our true nature, and our true nature is transcendental of the physical plane.
When we're going to be all having good thoughts and only goodness around, no more evil, nor jealousy, no more problems, really just concerned with the Torah and studying the Torah.
It is a feeling that emanates from within, that whatever deeds you do are done for goodness.
And to me, Mashiach means no more tears.
Moshiach, Moshiach, Moshiach. Moshiach, 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 Moshiach.
Today's topic is the third in a series on the theme of Moshiach. It is being beamed across the world, and we'd like to welcome our viewers all across North America, those in the Commonwealth Independent States, known colloquially as Russia, and a special welcome to our viewers in the land of Israel. Shalom to all of you. Today's panelists, two illustrious rabbis. On my right, on your left, Rabbi Berel. Rabbi Berel is the Dean of the Chaim-Mushka Seminary for Women here in Montreal. He's well known around the world as a lecturer and author. His tapes are available to thousands, and he is known as the lecturer of Rambam on the Line, the daily phone-in program to study the work of Maimonides. Good afternoon, Rabbi Berel. Our other panelist today comes from Minnesota. Rabbi Friedman is well known around the world, one of the world's most popular lecturers on topics of Judaism, Jewish tradition, and Jewish law. Rabbi Friedman is the dean of the Beis Chana Women's Institute in Minnesota, and he's the author of the book, Doesn't Anyone Blush Anymore?, a Simon & Schuster bestseller. His tapes have sold over 250,000 copies worldwide on all themes relating to Jewish life. We'd like to give a very warm welcome today to Rabbi Friedman. Perhaps we'll begin with Rabbi Friedman. What does Mashiach mean? Is Mashiach a concept? Is it an idea? Is Mashiach an individual? What does Mashiach mean?
One of the 13 principles of faith, fundamental principles of faith in Judaism, is the belief in the coming of Mashiach, which means really that when God created the world, there was a plan, there was a purpose, and that purpose and that plan has to be realized and has to be actualized. The coming of Mashiach and the times of Mashiach means the time when the world will become what God intended for it to be, a godly world, a world in which goodness is the norm rather than the exception.
Is belief in Mashiach an important concept in Judaism?
It's as important as saying that the creation has a purpose. Without Mashiach, then we misunderstand or we fail to appreciate the whole strength and power of all the mitzvahs, of all the commandments, of the entire revelation, of the entire Torah. Because the whole point of Torah is that through the commandments and through observing the laws that God gives us, we turn this world into a godly place. That's the whole point. So it is central not only to the particular belief in Mashiach, but to all the mitzvahs and to all of Judaism and to all of Jewish life, that what we're doing for 3,000 years, devoted to the mitzvahs, devoted to the commandments, is actually having an effect and will make the world godly, is making the world godly. And the coming of Mashiach is the culmination of that. To believe that after all these years, someone is going to come from heaven and take us to a different world, a better world, means that this world did not become godly. So the whole thing wasn't true, and that can't be. So Moshiach has to be a human being, and the changes have to be natural changes, and the physical world as we know it has to become heaven on earth.
But it occurs to me that the world has been waiting for this for a very long time. How can you believe something for so long?
People believe very deeply that, generally speaking, people are good. People are good. And that's a very irrational belief. Because if you read the newspapers and you take a look at any chapter in history, people are not good, to say the least. And yet we continue to hold this cherished belief that people are good. And we should believe it. We must believe it. How do we continue to believe something like that in spite of and in face of all the evidence to the contrary? So the answer is an ideal, any ideal, by definition, doesn't come from our experience. What we learn from experience tells us how things are. An ideal is the conviction of how things must be. So the fact that the world is not the way it must be doesn't change the fact that it must be a certain way. So an ideal means, though we believe or we are convinced or we carry this faith that inevitably, sooner or later, somehow or other, this is the way it must be. And if it's not yet that way today, then it will be tomorrow, because it must be. So the fact that it hasn't happened doesn't in any way diminish the belief that it's going to happen. The belief doesn't come from your experience, so no experience can destroy your belief. So the belief in Mashiach certainly doesn't come from the fact that Mashiach has always come, has always been here. The contrary. The belief in Mashiach comes from the fact that God promised that he will come, and that is the whole purpose of creation, and therefore it must happen. So every day that goes by and it doesn't happen, we don't believe less. On the contrary, we are more convinced that now that another day has gone by and Moshiach hasn't come, we are that much closer to the time when he will come, because he must come.
Just to add on one point, perhaps a metaphor, to clarify what Rabbi Friedman was talking about how definite we are of this in terms of our faith. When the example is sometimes brought of a person who was seriously ill and went to call a doctor. They're eagerly waiting the arrival of the doctor. The doorbell rings. They run to the door, and who is it? It's the mailman. So they accept the mail, wait a little longer. The doorbell rings a while later. They run to the door. The groceries. Groceries being delivered. Comes a third time the bell rings. It's another trivial delivery. They don't finally say, well, listen, we've been waiting so long, I guess he's just not going to come. Your anticipation becomes even greater the longer you have been waiting. It's as if to say, if a woman is expecting and she has false labor, and you say, well, she's had false labor. Obviously, she's never going to go into true labor. She's never going to have a baby. We know that it's on the contrary. The further we go in time, the more process must come to its culmination.
Rabbi Bill, do all Jews believe in the coming of Mashiach in this messianic era?
As mentioned previously, the idea of a messianic era, the idea of Mashiach is fundamental to Jewish faith. Anyone that accepts the fundamental principles of Judaism must, by definition, be accepting the idea of Mashiach. It's something which is intrinsic to Judaism.
Rabbi Friedman, perhaps you could enlighten us. What does Mashiach do in the world?
Maybe it would help to compare him to Moses. Moses was a regular human being and a great leader, took the Jews out of Egypt with the splitting of the sea and the event at Sinai and 40 years in the desert, and then in the end, for whatever reason, couldn't bring the Jews to the promised land. Every generation has a Moses, who was the inspired leader, the pace-setter, the spiritual guide. And in each generation, our belief in Moshiach meant that we believed that the Moses of that generation will be as great as the original Moses, as the first Moses. And not only that, but he will be able to do the one thing that Moshe did not do, and that is bring us permanently to the Promised Land and put an end to exile and suffering and so on, which would have happened if Moshe had brought us to the Promised Land. So the idea that Moshiach is simply an effective Jewish leader who influences, through his wisdom and moral teachings, influences the entire world, and does that one thing that the first Redeemer did not manage to do, and that is to bring us once and for all to the completion of the plan to the Promised Land.
Well, how do we know who Mashiach is?
Mashiach is recognized not by some kind of pedigree and not by some astrological signs. Mashiach is recognized by his accomplishments.
But Rabbi Bell, how can one man stop wars in the entire world? There's Muslim-Hindu battle currently raging in India. There's strife across the former Soviet Union. We're all aware of problems in Bosnia. And even on shores of North America, there's violence in every city. Certainly there's the Arab-Israeli conflict. How will Mashiach accomplish peace in the world?
I think it's important to understand that Judaism believes that the Creator is essentially good. The creation is essentially good, and individual nature is essentially good. In fact, there's nothing in rational thought to require nations to be at war. There is nothing intrinsically in the nature of the world that says that this must happen. This idea of world peace is something which is not only not contrary to human nature, but something which increasingly in recent years people have expressed their yearning for and have started to implement on a political level the idea that war must stop and there must be cooperation of all nations of the world to put it to an end. It's something which is there, the catalyst, the individual, to bring this to its head in the culmination. This is the individual Mashiach, and this will bring in the Messianic age.
But Rabbi Friedman, how does he do this? Does he go to Bosnia and have everyone sign a peace treaty under penalty of being struck by lightning? How does this work in practical terms?
Oh, if I knew that. I think there's a mystical balance of good and evil in the world. God created the world with a mixture of good and evil, light and dark, day and night. And that balance has been maintained throughout history in order that we have freedom of choice. Because if the good in the world becomes stronger or too strong, then it eliminates the possibility of sin. There's no freedom of choice. So good and the evil are constantly balanced in the world, as long as there is a purpose for the evil. But as we get closer to the end of that purpose, the end of the darkness, the end of evil, the good becomes more dominant, and the evil begins to fade. Now, this increased goodness is introduced into the world, as all things are introduced into the world, beginning at a geometric point and then spreading and getting broader and broader, having a ripple effect. The geometric point is the individual, the first person, the pioneer. And that is represented by Mashiach. So this goodness comes into the world through Mashiach. It disturbs the balance of good and evil, making the good dominant and more obvious and compelling than the evil. And as a result, the Rebbe pointed out, we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union simply because evil could not maintain itself anymore. And that means goodness is becoming too strong for evil to compete with. Or, if you don't want to use the word goodness, sanity has overtaken us. And we can no longer nonchalantly go about being evil. It just doesn't work anymore. And in that way, Moshiach introduces a compelling goodness that makes being good almost a reflex reaction.
Well, as we discuss goodness, let's go to the good people in our audience today and take any questions from the audience that we have.
The last number of years, we have become extremely aware and cognizant of the coming of the Messianic age, and as well the coming of the Moshiach. In the same vein, there has been this underlining intensity of the coming of the Messianic age and the coming of the Messiah. What indications do we have recently, or in the last number of years, in addition to what you have so astutely made us aware of, the Berlin Wall and the breakup of Eastern Europe, that give us this impetus, this new feeling of the coming of the Messiah and the beginning of the Messianic age?
If we want to look for signs of the physical development of the Messianic time, somebody said, look at all the suffering, look at all the evil that's going on in the world today after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think, if I'm not being overly optimistic, the evils that we read about in the paper today have been going on forever, but they never made the headlines. Because as long as we had a nuclear threat hanging over us, as long as there was the big Cold War, only that made headlines. The fact that women are being abused in a certain country, it's been going on forever. It doesn't make news. Now all of a sudden, that's the headline, which means that all of a sudden, the world is intolerant of evils that we tolerated for as long as anybody can remember. It simply was not headline material. Now it is. That's a very positive development. We have become intolerant of evil. Evils that we overlooked in the past. Number two, a positive sign, is the beating of the swords into plowshares, which has become a necessity. The world as we know it today makes it necessary to beat your swords into plowshares, which is in a way even better than if we all became very religious and decided to fulfill the prophecy by beating our swords into plowshares. Because then the whole process depends on our mood. If we suddenly become a little less pious, then we'll beat the plowshares back into swords. The fact that we're beating the swords into plowshares simply because we have no other choice. The world is such where swords don't do you much good. That's good news. That's Moshiach in the flesh. You don't even have to use the Hebrew word for it. And you hear people on the radio saying, the first time I heard it, it was really exciting. A casual conversation two people had on the radio. This guy is an expert on world economics or something. And he says, now that the Cold War is over, how does a country become a superpower? What will the superpower of tomorrow be? And he says very simply, the superpower of tomorrow is the country that exports the most wheat. In other words, he says, beating your swords into plowshares. And the interviewer says, yeah, right, that's biblical. The fact that it's not biblical, the fact that it's factual, that biblical things have now become factual things, that matters of faith are no longer matters of faith, they're happening. If someone were to say today, I believe that someday we will beat swords into plowshares, you don't believe that. You read it in the papers. It's actually going on. Without being pious about it or glassy-eyed, it's actually going on because that's the way the world is today. So these two things are rather encouraging, that the evils are not tolerable anymore and that we're beating our swords into plowshares and we can talk about mystical subjects in a very practical, everyday language.
Just to add on to this particular point about the various things that we see of an intolerance for injustice in the world, the whole idea of a return to values, which is being discussed today, not only socially but also on political level, that this is something which is essential. We get back to our old values and we're dissatisfied with the way our lives have been run on a social level up to now, I think is also an expression of this. And it's all an idea of taking into our own reality the transformation that is taking place. There's one other point I'd just like to add, which I think is important. Why it is that in this particular time there's been such a stress where it has not been perhaps in the public eye as much in previous generations. I think the essential motivating force behind this is the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who declared clearly, as he phrased it, as a prophetic revelation, that our generation is going to be the last generation of exile and the first generation of the Messianic age. And this is something which in every generation from the creation, there was potential for this Messianic age to be ushered in. And in every generation, there were potential figures that they could have been the Mashiach of their generation had the proper time come. There has never in history been a prediction by someone that has predicted the future accurately on many occasions, and therefore has the legal status in Jewish law as a prophet to say that this generation is going to be the one. And I think that is part of the reason why we are able to fit the world events into a framework. And as Rabbi Friedman said, the old events, the bad which is in the world, that's not news. That's what's been going on. These changes, people that say that you're being overly optimistic, picking out a few points, these points are the innovations that are happening in the world today, and therefore we have to open up our eyes and be aware that they're taking place.
In the times of Mashiach, all the Jewish people will be taken back to the land of Israel. Does that mean that life no longer goes on as normal? Do we work in our jobs, but our jobs are here? We're going to the land of Israel, and where's there housing for all of us in the land of Israel? There are many millions of Jews, and how do we get there? There are a limited number of El Al planes. Perhaps Rabbi Friedman and Rabbi Bell could both comment on this issue as it affects all of us.
The coming of Moshiach and the days of Moshiach, we already said, was primarily a time when goodness prevails, when the struggle between good and evil is resolved and the world becomes good. Now, part of that goodness is that the mitzvahs, the commandments that can be fulfilled only in Israel, will once again be able to be fulfilled, and that makes it necessary for all Jews to be back in the land of Israel together again. And as the Rebbe's point out, Moshiach's role is to complete those things that his great-grandfather, King David, began. And among those things, King David wanted all Jews to live under one kingdom, not divided into two kingdoms. He wanted to build the temple. And it turned out that his son built it for him. And he wanted all Jews to be observant and learned and knowledgeable in Jewish things. So Moshiach has to accomplish those things. As the world becomes holier, and as the opportunity for more holiness is available in Israel, Jews will gravitate towards Israel. Whether that will happen with real estate or without real estate or transfer of real estate, that's a technical thing, and we'll work it out when the time comes. But the important thing is that Israel becomes the center of godliness, and we gravitate towards that center, and eventually all Jews will be reunited there.
Rabbi Bell, will we go to work every day? Will we carry on our lives as we did the day before Mashiach arrived?
There are various stages in the Messianic age, and there are also various ways in which it could arrive. It could come in a natural way, and it could come in a miraculous way. Now, if it's happened in a miraculous way, then everything will be miraculous, and we enter into a time period in which our whole lives are devoted, all of our lives, the entire day is devoted to the pursuit of holiness and holy activities. If things happen in a natural way, we'll continue to work and continue to eat and drink and sleep and carry on our lives as normal, but on a holier plane, on a higher level. What that means for our real estate investments, if it happens in a miraculous way, then everything could just have immediate transferal. If it happened in a more natural way, we don't know how exactly it would be, but I certainly imagine that whatever possessions and whatever housing and whatever possessions people have, they could certainly be bought out to get something, convinced to take upon something which is even nicer and better and more lavish. And this is one of the aspects of the Messianic age, as Maimonides explains it, that all of our physical needs will be taken care of in ample abundance, both in terms of wealth, health, and all physical necessities.
Rabbi Friedman, you say that it's only on when Moshiach will come in Eretz Israel, that's the place where they're going to make the mitzvot. So how come, I understand that we need some religious people around the world, but how come all the majority of the religious people doesn't go to live in Israel?
When God sent us into exile, it was not merely a punishment for sin, but also the fulfillment of a vast eternal plan. Jews have been spread throughout the world to the four corners of the heavens, as the Torah says, because there is a purpose in bringing the teachings of Yiddishkeit and the holiness of mitzvahs to all the corners of the world, to cover the entire geography of the world. So as long as there is a need, and as long as there is a corner of the world still needs to be elevated, sanctified, introduced to the holiness of Torah, then we have to be there to do that. The coming of Moshiach means that we have completed that job. When the Jews left Egypt and were trapped between the sea and the Egyptian army, some of them said, let's go back to Egypt. And the deeper explanation as to why anybody would want to go back to Egypt and why anybody would have that opinion is that the Jews felt that they were leaving Egypt prematurely and that their purpose for coming to Egypt in the first place had not yet been completed. And that's why they were hesitant to follow Moshe out of Egypt. When they finally did follow him out, and now they find themselves trapped in an impossible situation, it occurred to them that maybe they had been right in the first place and that they had left prematurely. So they said, let's go back to Egypt, not because they enjoyed being slaves or because they had a slave mentality. They said, let's go back to Egypt because obviously we didn't finish our mission there. When Mashiach comes, we will have no such doubts. And the job and the mission will be completed totally to the degree that the nations among whom we live will actually encourage and help Jews come back to Israel, like we're beginning to see now with Russia. Not only are the Jews of Russia allowed to go to Israel, in many ways the government is actually helping, facilitating that.
Just to follow up this point, the coming of the Jewish people to Israel, Maimonides says, is something which happens through Mashiach. And the actual ingathering of the exiles, it's something which happens after the temple is built. So although it's certainly allowed, and there are many merits and many mitzvahs which can be fulfilled today in Eretz Yisrael, but the final ingathering of the exiles, which is the sign of the Messianic age, happens after the temple is rebuilt. On this idea of the hesitance of the Jewish people and their eagerness to return to Egypt, which Rabbi Friedman mentions, interesting to note that there's a medrash called Psikta that says that a similar phenomenon will happen immediately preceding the Messianic age, that just as Moses was somewhat unsuccessful and had difficulties convincing the Jewish people to leave the Egyptian exile, so too Mashiach will have difficulty convincing the Jews in the times of Messianic redemption also to come out. And it says that they will refer to him as Rabbeinu Melech HaMashiach. They will call him the Messianic King, and he will tell them the time has come to come out of redemption and return to Eretz Yisrael. And they're going to say, well, we're not really ready, and how do we merit this, and how could it be? The time has not yet come.
You said before that we're going to be involved in the pursuit of godliness and learning Torah all day, and that life is going to really go on as normal. But really, for the most of us, that's not what we do.
What does it mean to spend your time in the pursuit of the knowledge of God? To say that in simple English, it means simply that today we struggle with, more than with anything else, we struggle with the search for meaning, to make sense of life, to make sense of our existence. That really is our main preoccupation. Only today we think that if we make more dollars, it will make life meaningful, and then life will make more sense. because then we'll have the time to be able to study these subjects. Will explain to us why life makes sense. So we're going about it in a kind of a roundabout way. But really, even today, what is our preoccupation? What really weighs heavily on our mind and on our heart? What really is important to us? Not money. We see money as a stepping stone, as a means to an end, not as an end in itself. We see success as a means to an end, not as an end to itself. So what Mashiach is simply going to do, or the time of Mashiach is going to do to us, is that instead of going about searching for meaning and finding satisfaction and be meaningful through roundabout ways and desperate ways, we'll finally go right to the point and say, wait a minute, if the meaning of life comes from the understanding of God's purpose, then let's get right down to it and understand it. So we're not really that far from that even today.
Excuse me, I would like to know what this sign means behind your back. Prepare yourself for Mashiach. And do we have in our generation somebody like Moshe Rabbeinu that be the potential Mashiach?
The sign says, prepare for the coming of Mashiach. I think preparing for the coming of Mashiach is different from the statement, believe in the coming of Mashiach. Belief in the coming of Mashiach has existed since the beginning of creation. When God asked Moshe to go down to Egypt and take the Jews out of Egypt, Moshe said, don't send me, send Mashiach. So the belief in Mashiach and the hope for Mashiach has been around for a long time. What we're saying today is that in addition to the faith in Mashiach, in addition to the hope in the coming of Mashiach, in addition even to the looking forward to the coming of Mashiach, we have to do one more thing, and that is prepare for the coming of Mashiach. If it's just a matter of faith, then when Mashiach comes, it will be overwhelming. It will change our existence too dramatically and too shockingly, and we won't be able to handle it. Prepare for the coming of Mashiach means very simply be prepared. And be prepared means make Mashiach real in your life, make the things Mashiach will do real in your life in preparation, so that when it happens, you're already prepared. You're already in that frame of mind, you're already in that mood, you're already seeing and understanding the changes that are going on in the world which Mashiach is bringing.
You have to clearly define what terms you mean, because there are certainly three different categories. Leaving the idea of Mashiach as an age and not an individual aside, there are three possible things that a person could mean when they say that a certain individual is Mashiach. As Rabbi Friedman mentioned, every generation there is an individual who is fit to be Mashiach should that generation merit. And that's been true throughout all ages. We have many cases in the Talmud throughout Jewish history of students referring to their teacher and their leader, and the leader of the generation and so on, as being the Mashiach of their generation. In addition, Maimonides in his legal code, which is in effect the only description we actually have in Jewish law of the characteristics and the qualities of Mashiach, gives a set of prerequisites. It has to be a descendant of King David, a person who is well-versed in the entire body of Jewish knowledge, a person that works to bring Jews throughout the world closer to Judaism, and one that fights constantly for holy causes. If you see a person fulfilling all of these qualities, it's assumed that this person is the Mashiach. Whether or not the actual arrival, the Bias HaMashiach, the final arrival of Mashiach, is a later stage, again, only when he is successful in building the temple in Jerusalem and bringing the Jewish people back to Eretz Yisrael. Once that happens, we know that the transformation of the world to a peaceful place, and a place without war, disease, and other negative consequences of the universe as we have now, once we have this final stage of the building of the temple and the ingathering of exile, then we know that the final change in the world is going to be eventually completed.
Isn't it true that traditionally, though, the waiting for Mashiach was done quietly in one's synagogue, in one's room, in one's private prayers, in one's heart? Yet today we see billboards and bumper sticker signs on cars, keychains, television commercials, etc. Is this the proper way to tell the world to prepare for the coming of Moshiach?
I think the essential point is that in those days when it was being done in the synagogue, first, it wasn't being done particularly quietly. It's something which a great deal of interest and a great deal of energy and talk was put into. Even in the times of the Holocaust, when people went to their deaths, they were singing the An Ma'amin, expressing this essential fact of Jewish faith, the belief in the coming of Mashiach. But there's one very, very important difference between past generations and this generation. The reason then everything was discussed in the synagogue is because that's where the Jews were. They were in the synagogue. Today, not all Jews are in the synagogue. Jews can not only be reached with the message of the coming of Mashiach by giving a small class and making a gathering and speaking about it in the synagogue. People see things on billboards. People see things in the mass media. And if we don't make Mashiach an elitist concept that is only for a small group of people, for a small group of Jews, and it's something for all Jews all over the world, from all different ways of life, the only way to reach out to them is in a way in which they will understand, in a way to which they will relate. Therefore, although in Talmudic times, no, they did not put up billboards, but they didn't need to put up billboards. It's something that was known, was an essential part of Jewish faith. And if we want to reach out to everyone, we have to use the mass media, which Judaism believes that every technological advance which happens in the world should be used for a good cause. In this case, why was the billboard made to begin with? Judaism looks at it as being a vehicle to reach certain people who cannot be reached any other way.
But if you mention that in every generation there is a potential Mashiach, and in every generation until now, Mashiach has not arrived, is it not dangerous to arouse people's hopes and expectations? Perhaps they would be dashed and we would be left tremendously saddened, and perhaps it would be impossible for the Jewish people and the entire world to rise from this sadness. Rabbi Friedman.
Great hopes and positive thinking and great expectations for the future is what makes progress and civilization move forward. Without that, we have nothing. If we were going to worry, or if we should have worried about disappointed feelings and disillusionment, then there should never have been an idealism called communism. There should never have been the attempt to create a United Nations. I mean, these are all messianic concepts. That's what gives momentum to all progress, to all growth, to all positive developments. Of course, often these hopes turn out to be disasters, like with communism, but without them, there is no growth at all. So although there may be disappointment when you hold out a very intense hope, of course there may be disappointment, but without that hope, then there's no way to go. We have decadence. We end right there. And that's true of any kind of hope and of any kind of optimism for the future. Today, this kind of hope is coming not from a teaching, not from a belief, but from grassroots, so to speak. We can actually see the world becoming good. We can actually see a time when there will be no war. We can actually see a time when there will be no hunger, because it is possible. It's not unreal anymore. So on the one hand, in answer to your question, this hope that we have is a very realistic one and a visible one. We can actually chart it. All it takes is a little bit of goodness and a little common concern, which is also dawning on us because we've become a very small planet, and if we don't share our concerns, nobody wins. The end of the Cold War didn't come because Gorbachev was a tzaddik. It came because no one can win. It's a no-win situation. So the goodness is not only something that we hope is going to happen, it's almost inevitable. It must happen. We're on that path. And secondly, if the Torah says that it's going to happen, then not only may we build up our hopes, but we must. This is part of our belief. This is what Torah expects of us. And if Torah expects it, then you can go with it. And if, God forbid, Moshiach doesn't come immediately, then we ought to be disappointed and we ought to be upset, because the fact that Moshiach is going to come 10 minutes later means 10 more minutes of pain and of suffering and of torture for 5 billion people. And that should not be tolerable to us. So if Moshiach doesn't come 10 minutes earlier, that should be very upsetting. And we should be uncomfortable with that. And to say, well, let's not get our hopes up so that we don't get hurt, that's not good. If the suffering goes on, it should hurt.
If we take into consideration that from the time Moses announced himself to the Jewish leaders coming back to Egypt, saying, I'm here, I am, through my speaking, one way or the other, going to take you out of Egypt, out of Golis, if we'll take it to this time. And we look 40-odd years later when they actually make it into Israel, as we have the time of the miracles. That took a certain amount of time. We're saying, hey, we're here, but we're still having trouble. And then going out into the wilderness, getting the Torah, and the generation that left Israel, that left Egypt, is not the generation that went into Israel. And this generation is supposed to be the one that will go out of Golis into the new generation. We're talking about possible time of, if we just all of a sudden change longevity, we could be talking another couple of 100 years before we have a tangible effect for us here.
Well, there's a big difference. When Moshe came to the Jews in Egypt, the Golis was not over. He was coming to end the exile. And that's why there had to be the 10 plagues, destruction of Egypt, and breaking out of Egypt. What we're dealing with today is not that when Moshiach comes and says, I am Moshiach and I will take you out of Golis, that's when it all begins. It began 2,000 years ago with the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So with Moshe, you say it took about 40 years to complete the job. We've already invested 2,000 years. We're not starting the Geula. We're completing the Golos. 2,000 years invested in this project. It's really time already. We don't have to start now. We're ending now. So there's a big difference there. Moshe had to destroy Egypt. Not only physically, but also within the Jewish hearts. They hadn't outgrown it. They hadn't finished with Egypt. They were whisked out of there because it was simply time to go. Here we're talking about a job that has been completed. We've done the job. We've completed the task. And that's why now the world is ready for Mashiach. We're not going to break out of the world to go to Mashiach, to go to the redemption. The world is going to participate in this redemption. So it's a whole different picture from the way it was with Moshe.
If Mashiach is only good and it's the ultimate utopia, I want to understand why there's so much controversy in this whole area of Mashiach. Like, what are people scared of?
People who are afraid that if we get really carried away about the coming of Moshiach, then we become irresponsible. So then projects begin to fall apart. I mean, why are you going to build a new school? Why will you build a new medical facility if you believe that Moshiach is going to come and fix it all? Then you don't have to do anything. So there is the fear of the throwing off of responsibility that comes with the belief that Moshiach is coming tomorrow anyway, so why bother? Which is a legitimate fear. Of course, Torah doesn't permit that. You can be very excited that Moshiach is coming tomorrow, but every mitzvah in Torah is still absolutely obligatory and compulsory, and you have to do it. So if a person is hungry and he knocks on your door and says, can you give me a meal, can you give me a donation, you can't say Mashiach is coming soon, because Mashiach can do many wonderful things, can't fulfill mitzvahs for you. So your mitzvahs you still have to fulfill yourself. And therefore, the commitments and the obligations and the responsibilities go on, if anything, with increased enthusiasm.
When Mashiach comes and all the people go to Israel, what will be the function of Mashiach? What will be his job? is he going to be an immortal human being that will take care of the Jewish people forever and ever? Will someone take over? This is what I'd like to know.
Rabbi Friedman, over to you.
The role of Moshiach is simply the role of a king who runs his country and takes care of his people and provides for his people and so on. And that's why he's called Melech HaMashiach. He's a king. And he literally the heir to the throne of King David, which is the royal family of Israel. So on a very practical level, Moshiach is the king of Israel in the most classical and most positive sense of the word, a king who rules through goodness and through godliness, through holiness, and becomes a model for the rest of the world and the fulfillment of the prophecy that Jews were created to be a light to the nations. And that light means simply knowledge, understanding of godliness, and the motivation for goodness. So when Mashiach comes, he will establish a country, a people, a kingdom, a government that is a model for the rest of the world.
Well, Rabbi Friedman, you mentioned that Mashiach will be a king, and then you mentioned the word government. I think we would generally believe in the Western world that we've come a long way from a monarchy, and that we have monarchs today only as figureheads, but democracy is the ultimate way to govern. Is that the way the world will be governed, or will it be governed by a Mashiach king?
Well, there are great virtues in democracy, but democracy is not perfect. There are good things in the world, but they're not perfect. Mashiach's kingdom will have all the virtues of democracy, plus the virtues of truth and of godliness. So it will become the ultimate model for government.
For our closing remarks, I'd first like to go to our local rabbi, Rabbi Berel.
Maariv tells us that every single individual has an impact on the entire world. In fact, a single action from a single individual could be the one to tip the scales and actually bring the redemption. Every single one of us has a unique purpose. Every single one of us has a unique ability. And we should use that every moment of our lives to add on in good deeds, in goodness and kindness, and to tip the scales. And perhaps this one act, this one good word, or even this one good intention could be the final one to bring the redemption.
The coming of Mashiach means goodness becomes real, not ideal. So if we want to really prepare for Mashiach, the steps are what you intended to do, do it. What you hope to someday be able to do in terms of goodness, do it now.
Thank you, Rabbi Friedman. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm round of applause.
לא יחכה לו בכל יום שיבוא שישמע עם כל זה יחכה לו בכל יום שיבוא שיבוא מאמין אני